And now may the words of my mouth and the meditation of my heart be always acceptable in thy sight, O Lord, my strength and my Redeemer. Amen. Not too long ago, I took some time out to call an old friend in Mississippi, a woman named Trudy Perry. And in the course of talking to her and catching up with her, she had some exciting news to share, which was she was going to be a grandmother for the first time. Her daughter was due at that time, almost any day, to give birth to a little boy named Asa. So it was exciting news for her and great to talk and catch up with her. And we spent some time conversing. And then at the end of the conversation, I told her I loved her. This middle-aged black woman from Mississippi then told me she loved me too. And as I think about that, it makes me think of our reading this morning in Leviticus chapter 19, and especially that very last verse, where it says, love your neighbor as yourself. That's the same command we hear Jesus give in the Gospels. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, all your soul, all your mind, and all your strength, and love your neighbor as yourself. Now, sometimes when we hear that, whether it's in Leviticus or in the Gospels, the focus becomes, well, who is my neighbor? Who am I supposed to love? Remember, that's what the Pharisees tried to trap Jesus with, in a sense, which launched him into the story of the Good Samaritan. When Jesus gave that commandment, love the Lord your God with all your heart, all your soul, all your mind, and all your strength, and your neighbor as yourself, they tried to kind of trip him up by asking, well, who is my neighbor? And then, of course, Jesus went on to tell them the story of the Good Samaritan. But for our purposes this day, I don't want to focus so much on who the neighbor is as what does it really mean to love? That seems to be the key word in the command. Love your neighbor as yourself. So what does that mean for us? To love someone else. I think most of us have a picture of that in our mind, of red hearts and Cupid and Hallmark movies and romantic love. And there's not necessarily anything wrong with that. That may be a component of it. But I think love is bigger than that. Because the first thing I think we can definitively say about love is much more of an action than it is a feeling. It is much more of an action instead of how we feel. I can love someone else without having gooey, sentimental, hearts and flowers feelings about them. And when we're called to love someone else, it does not mean that we have to have those strong emotional feelings about them. When we are told to love others, it is a command to act, to take an action, to do something, instead of feel something. I would ask those that have been married for some time, and I guess the definition of some time depends on how good your marriage is. For some people, a long time may be just a couple of years. But we've got a lot of people in here who have been married a long time, who have been in a relationship for a long time. And I would bet with almost 100% certainty that while you still love your partner all these years later, your feelings have changed. That is, in the beginning, love was that kind of gooey, sentimental hearts and flowers Hallmark feeling. That may have been what attracted you in the first place. That may have been the spark that ignited everything. But over the years, that passion has cooled. Now, does that mean we don't love the other person anymore? Of course not. Just because the romantic feelings have changed does not mean that we should stop loving the other person. I think that is a huge problem in our society and would be willing to bet that's one of the leading causes of divorce and separation. Well, I just don't love him anymore. I've fallen out of love with her. No, your feelings have changed. Your romantic feelings may have changed. But love is not based solely on romantic feelings. It is an action. It is something I can do, not just how I feel. So as you move along in a marriage, as you move along in a relationship, you still love the other person, but you show it in action in different ways, other than those wildly romantic ways back in the beginning. All right, so if love is an action and not a feeling, what kind of action is it? What does that mean? Well, the Bible clearly tells us that the ideal form of love, agape in the Greek, that action is a sacrifice. It is a sacrificial action we take on behalf of others. That is, if I love someone else, I am going to sacrifice something for them. And the model for this, of course, is Jesus, who loved us and sacrificed himself for others by the giving of his body and his blood and his very life. And that commandment to lay down our lives, to sacrifice for others, is all over the New Testament. In just one example from John 15:13, remember Jesus said, "Greater love than this has no man than that he lay down his life for his friends." Sometimes uniquely in a physical way, but more often sacrificing a part of yourself out of love for another person. So we can then truly say, to love someone else is to sacrifice, to give up a part of ourselves, to give ourselves over in some way for that other person. And that can be lived out in dozens of different and unique ways. Someone can love a special needs child by giving up their wants and desires and taking care of that child, which, as we all know, is an incredibly difficult thing to do. We can sacrifice for people in all kinds of ways like that. Giving up our time, giving up our wants, giving up our needs, because we sacrifice them out of love for someone else. Love ultimately is an action, and that action, as Jesus so clearly showed, is a sacrifice. So there's something about giving up of ourselves involved here, some portion of ourselves. And that's also what we see, I think, in that reading from 1 Thessalonians, and especially that verse at the very end, where it reads, and Paul is, of course, writing here, that we so deeply care about you, he's writing to the Thessalonians, that we not only shared the gospel with you, we shared our very selves. So that is a really important idea. We shared our very selves. We cared for you so deeply. We loved you so much. We gave you a part of ourselves that we shared with you, a part of our very lives, which is exactly what we're called to do today. Jesus is calling us to share ourselves, our lives, our fortunes, our very presence with others. And it seems to me there's something more to it than simply giving money to someone. Yes, that's a part of it. We could share ourselves by helping support someone financially or by tithing. Nothing wrong with that. That is highly and strongly encouraged. But when you think about it, if that's all we're doing, how much of ourselves are we truly giving up? How much of ourselves are we truly sharing by writing a check or making a donation? Again, I'm not criticizing people that do that. I'm just saying, as I think about this and as I read it, there seems to be something more to it than that. Because the whole point of all of this, everything we do, is to reach out to others in love, to bring them the love of Jesus, and then to get them to follow Jesus with us. To get them to go along with us as we follow Jesus through this life. And it's very difficult to get someone to follow where you're leading if they don't see that you're committed to it. If they see that you're only in part way. If you're willing to write a check but no more, it's very, very hard for people to follow that. People are willing to follow leaders who are willing to commit themselves, share themselves, go all in, which is exactly what Jesus is calling us to do, because that's exactly what Jesus did for us. You think about the Last Supper, for example. What did Jesus do? He shared his very self, his body, his blood. He was with his disciples. He had just spent the last 3 years sharing with them everything intimately. Teaching them about God, walking with them, eating with them, healing with them, praying with them. He shared everything about himself. He walked right alongside them. And now at the Last Supper, he is giving them his very body and blood, sharing himself with them. He didn't just tell them, hey guys, there'll be a meal at such and such place. I can't be there with you. I've got more important things to do. The food will be provided. Don't worry about it. He was there, sharing his very presence. And of course, there's no greater example of Jesus sharing himself and giving up himself than at the cross, where he gave everything he had for those he loved. His body, his blood, and his very life, even for those who were jeering at him, mocking him, ridiculing him, and proving once again that love is an action, much more than a feeling. Because while Jesus was on the cross, hearing the jeers and the ridicule, he probably didn't feel very close to them. He probably didn't have very strong feelings of empathy toward them. But oh, what he did in action. And he was willing to say at the end, "Forgive them, Father, for they know not what they do." I don't know if I've shared this story with all of you. I think some of it have heard it before. But Darlene and I met Trudy about, I want to say almost 10 years ago now, as part of a mission project down in Mississippi. We were, together with Pastor Randy, looking for someone to help, someone to invest our time in. And God led us to Trudy, a single mother with 2 girls living in absolute squalor in her home. Leaky roof, basement filled with water. There were raccoons running through the house because of the holes in the floor. So we started working with her. And she was very suspicious at first. As I said, black woman, why are these white people helping me? What do they want? And she would even say that. But we stuck with it. It wasn't a matter of us writing a check and handing it to her. It was us working with her and being with her and being in her home and inviting her to our home day after day after day. And I'll never forget what she said at the beginning. She said, I just can't believe this. There's got to be a catch. You have to want something. And finally, Pastor Randy told her in front of the group, we don't want anything except to love you. And you are so part of this family now, you could not get rid of us if you wanted to. And here it is 10 years later, and she's still a part of our extended family. All because a few people were willing to reach out in love. Love as an action, not a feeling. Love as getting in and doing and not saying, boy, that's really a bad way. You're really in a tough way. I'll keep praying for you. Love as working with her day after day after day and not simply writing a check. It was love as an action, as a sacrifice, and love as sharing ourselves with someone else. Jesus shared himself as well. On the cross, at the Last Supper, all throughout his ministry, and he calls us to do the same. Do we care enough about others? Do we care enough about our neighbor? Do we care so deeply, as Paul wrote, that we're willing to share not only the gospel, but to share our very selves? Amen.